guys, good morning.
Good morning.
Guys, let's check in first thing. Today and Wednesday this week, we're going to be finishing up Chapter 3. We've been on Chapter 3 for about a week and a half now, and we are going to wrap it up, this basic coverage of labor laws. And what we're going to do on Wednesday, we're going to review Chapters 1, 2, and 3, and we're also going to go through the unfair labor practice procedure. I told you guys on Friday we'd do that today. We're going to do that on Wednesday instead. If you recall, we had kind of a breakdown structure we went through on Friday in terms of how that actually works. We're going to cover it in depth on Friday, even though we'll be covering it later in the class. You can see how complicated this is. Now this Friday, because I've made the promise to you that we're not going to do assignments due on Mondays, this Friday and Monday, we're going to be splitting it up into two halves. We're going to be watching a movie together called American Factory. Has anybody heard of this film? If you haven't seen it yet, it's a really, really cool film. And it's about Youngstown, Ohio, where we had a GM plant that closed, got bought by a Chinese company. And the Chinese company essentially took over a labor plant in a very heavily unionized area. It's a documentary, and it's a very unflinching view about what it's like for people who are used to a certain standard of income working for General Motors, having to adapt to a new rule of the road. So we're going to be doing that between Friday and Monday. Friday, I will not be here, but I will be proctoring and taking attendance. You got to be here. You got to watch the movie. And on Monday, I'll be finishing the movie with you. Next Wednesday, in this classroom, we're going to be having our first test. It is going to be an in-class exam for our first one. Here's the deal, guys. Do well on this test. Show me that you have listened and participated in class. Maybe the second test will be a take-home. So we're going to study for this. You have plenty of notice to be ready for this exam. The exam will be primarily true and false and multiple choice with possibly a couple short answers and a couple of bonus questions as well. So we're going to be covering that and reviewing in class on Wednesday. And yes, I will provide you with study materials. Guys, some other things to be keeping in mind. This Friday, your next assignment is due 1 to 3 page paper telling me whether or not you think federal or state workers should be allowed to organize. Should they be allowed to form unions? I'm asking you to give me 3 sources. I'm asking you to cite them in text. I'm asking you to give me a background as well in terms of a bibliography as well. Keep it succinct. Keep it to the point. Paraphrase. I don't want to see big quotations that form entire paragraphs. Paraphrase the ideas. Make them your own. Give me a substantial answer to the question. Guys, in terms of your first or your next extra credit activity, this Friday, come to see Dr. Michael Huseland speak. Get 2 points on the exam. He's going to be talking in JFK Auditorium, 7 p.m. this Friday. If you don't know who this guy is, if you like superhero films, you have him to thank. He is the guy who made the first Batman film come to the big screen in 1989. Since then, he has been the executive producer on every Batman film ever made. He's responsible for $1.7 trillion in global box office receipts. This is the real deal. If this guy hadn't made the first Batman film in '79, we would not have the Marvel movie franchise, we would not have the X-Men, we would not have all these other things. He is the godfather of superhero cinema. He's the real deal. Here's the trick, guys. The first Batman film came out in '89. Anybody know when he actually got the rights to make that film? How long it took him to get that first film made? He got the rights in 1979. No studio in Hollywood would touch it. They said basically this is box office poison. It's going to be a bomb. Nobody will go see this movie. Well, 16 movies later and 1.7 trillion later in just this franchise. He also, by the way, produced some shows you may have watched as kids. As a kid, if you ever watched Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, he's behind that as well. The movie Constantine, a lot of films. So he's going to be here. He's part of Bat Flash Week, which starts today. Please come to this event. It's going to be really exciting. So, guys, we left off talking about the LMRA and the NLRB. Of course, the Labor Management Relations Act and the National Labor Relations Board. Guys, one of the things that has been really a challenge in our current environment right now, do we have a Republican or a Democrat as president? We got a Republican. Stereotypically, a Republican's pro-labor or pro-ownership, pro-management. They're typically pro-management. This is a situation where most labor unions, however, a lot of them supported this particular president. However, his cabinet administration tends to favor companies over individuals. They also, in our current labor policy, try to drag out decision-making so that unions have less of a say. Basically, let's say, for example, if you're trying to allow people to organize, if companies have issues, for example, that end up in the courts, if they involve labor management issues, sometimes those issues don't get decided on for a long period of time. We basically have laws on the books that take a lot of legislation behind them, a lot of process, and oftentimes, by the time a dispute gets settled, it's a dead issue. For example, if there's a labor and management issue that drags on so long that the company is actually closed in the meantime, it doesn't really benefit anybody except sometimes employers who are able to get out with what money they can pull out. If you look at some of the things we've talked about, for example, with the mines, you remember Jim Lamont had said, for example, the Mine Safety Health Administration had repeatedly cited several of these mines for violations and given them fines, and the company simply paid the fines and kept operating. That's an example of how labor policy right now tends to favor companies as opposed to individuals. So that's some criticism that's going on. What the unions want to see happen with the Labor Management Relations Act, they want to be able to have greater access to employees. Let's say, for example, if a union wanted to organize at a factory, we're going to be talking about this right now. Does a factory have to allow union organizers in the door? Who thinks no? Raise your hand if you think no, they don't have to let them in. Who thinks yes, they do have to let them in? Who has no idea? So you're going to raise your hand and say, I have no idea. It's okay not to have an idea. Guys, it's a complicated answer. If you said you had no idea, it could be decided either way. Here's the thing. If you have what we refer to as a non-solicitation policy, for example, if I say nobody can come in here and solicit on my grounds, you'll notice this, by the way, if any of you have occasion to go to a shopping mall for any reason, there are signs that say we do not allow solicitation. If you want to go in and put union flyers out or you want to hand out flyers for your band, they ban all of that stuff. So an employer can say, I have a no solicitation policy, I'm not allowing organizers in. However, if you allow the Salvation Army to come in, if you allow people at Christmas time who are doing fund drives to come in, if you allow somebody to hang hoagie posters, if they're selling sandwiches for the kids' Little League team, technically you don't really back up your no solicitation policy. So technically speaking, if you allow one person in, you have to allow most of them in. Go ahead.
Doesn't Walmart get around that in a way? Because like every time I go to one, there's something new outside, but haven't they kind of like got around letting, or like they can pick who they let?
They've skirted the issue by saying, look, this is a matter of public good, and they also have lawyers to help them keep that stuff held up in the courts. So to say that that is an actual issue of black and white, it's not. It comes down to who has more money to throw at the question. You're absolutely right, yes.
When it comes to Walmart, I've read some weird stories about how they keep people from getting unions. Like they have like supposedly people that are like go to the stores and like listen around, hear if there's union talk and everything.
Dude, all I can tell you is if you got more money than God, and you're Walmart, you can hire people to do just about anything. And the idea of a store detective being paid to walk around in Walmart clothing or dressed as a plainclothes person, listening in on conversations, is not beyond the realm of possibility. Here's the other thing, guys. Has anybody ever been in a sheet store when they do a security check? They have an intercom that fires up. And it's two-way verbal communication between the people working in the store and headquarters based in Claysburg or Altoona. Sheet stores have the ability to monitor audio and video in every single store that they operate. So is it conceivable that Walmart could have similar capabilities? I think so. They've got better logistics than anybody in the world. Fundamentally, though, if you're allowing one group in, you have to allow them all in. Now, if you have a no solicitation policy and you allow nobody in, you might have a leg to stand on. The bottom line, though, is that unions are saying we need to have more access, even if it means giving us a break room or a lunchroom that employees can come and listen to our pitch when they're not working. We want this. They also want some other supports, for example. They want the idea that if they're on strike, that employers cannot hire permanent replacements for them. The employer return to that is, well, if you went on strike and you violated the terms of your contract, air traffic controllers, we should be able to hire permanent replacements. But basically what it comes down to is that the unions are saying that the current Labor Management Relations Act is still favored toward employers, not employees, and we want greater access. Some of the other things, too, in terms of the reason cases get processed so poorly. part of it is, even though we have all these laws on the books, sometimes the cases themselves are fairly unique. If we've got labor disputes or unfair labor practice disputes, for example, it takes time for these things to move through the courts. The courts themselves don't have a big press on. If we look at where the big press is coming in the administration right now, I'll be impressed if somebody in this room knows the answer to this one, but we'll see. There's been one area of the judicial process where the current administration has been doing a ton of hiring of judges. What process am I talking about? What is the patron cause of the current administration from a legal perspective? Anybody know? They're not hiring for the NLRB. They're not resolving labor disputes, but they are hiring immigration judges because they absolutely want to speed up that process because of the president's stance on immigration. I am not endorsing or denying that stance. I'm telling you the fact. We're, in terms of getting additional judges coming in en masse to make sure labor decisions get made more quickly, it ain't happening because right now it's not a big priority to the president. So guys, in terms of some of the other labor relations that we've had, we always talk about the railroads and how important that they were prior to the advent of things like mass transportation over gasoline-powered cars and trucks and buses. The railway, prior to about the 1950s, was actually the main way we moved goods and services. Still the most efficient, guys. Here's the trick. If you want to know a little bit of history, who here has ever heard of cable cars? You know what a cable car is? What's a cable car, Elliot? Still have in San Francisco.
Oh, the cable cars that go around on the roads, and you see them on the small little bit of rail, but they're also connected on top.
You got it. They're powered by electricity. You used to see them in major cities throughout the United States, even not so major cities. If you want to know why, when you drive to Altoona, there are certain sections of the roads that still have rails right in the middle of the roads in downtown, because we used to have cable cars. When the automobile industry came to prominence in the 1950s, they actually put pressure on lobbyists to get rid of rail and get rid of rail cars and cable cars so they could sell more cars. Which, by the way, if you want to know why we're enjoying so many traffic jams even getting out of any major city at this point in time, that has its roots in the 1950s. But I digress. The Railway Act of 1926 was the first in the country to have a totally comprehensive collective bargaining law. And what we mean by that is we had institutionalized the rules and regulations for people being able to form a union and to be able to have clear rules and mandates to operate on. Now that was 1926. Of course, you remember the airlines weren't that big of a thing back in that period of time. We were still getting started. We covered it in 1936 to include airlines as well. So this comes down to what we refer to as required mediation. And that means if there's a dispute between the people who work for the railroad or the airline industry and their employers, for example, unionized employees and their employers, it has to go through a mediation board. Why would the government take such a heavy-handed approach to these particular industries? Why would they insist that this goes through a mediation process? Why were these such important industries? Any guesses? 1936. How is everything moving across the country? It's Monday, guys. Help me out. What was so important, Sarah? Yeah, for sure. The mail. We didn't have email. We didn't have internet. This moved information, moved products, moved services. We didn't have drones. We had rail, guys, and this is a brief video about why this first act was so what people should be members of public unions in the first place. We'll talk more about that. Guys, we're going to get back into our lecture today, despite the fact that our PowerPoint decided to take a little break, but we are back now. All right, in terms of the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978, for any of us who are in the world business majors here or in the class who are business majors, what's the difference between a regulated and a deregulated industry? Who can give me an example of a regulated industry? A place where the government has significant control over commerce. Yes?
Alcohol.
Absolutely. Tell me, in the great state of Pennsylvania, what kind of wonderful regulations did we enjoy?
They just upped the taxes on it again, and I don't think they understand that we're already running on a slim margin. But you can't make a certain amount of alcohol without a certain kind of license. You can't sell food in your location without a certain kind of license. And if they buy food in your location, then they can't buy over 126 ounces of beer unless you have the right license for it. But even then, it can't be in the same transaction. You have to legit go to this restaurant that is also a brewery, buy your meal, end your transaction, and then start a new one. Because for some reason, that's different than me just tacking on your extra couple of six-packs.
I hit a nerve. Wow. Wow. I'm glad somebody's got some passion in this room today. So thank you, man. In fact, if you want to make a speech, you have my permission to stand on this table when you do it and scream that. I'm with you, brother. When it comes down to the Sheetz in Altoona, the 17th Street Sheetz, because they sell beer, you know what they can't sell? Motor oil. Because you can't sell motor oil at the same. I swear to God, it is a rule in the Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board. They can sell gas there because it's a restaurant, but they can't sell oil in the store because it's a restaurant, and you can't sell oil in a restaurant in Pennsylvania if you're also selling alcohol. Don't ask me why. And for anybody who is of age here, Ryan's absolutely correct. If I go to my local six-pack store, how many six-packs can I buy at a time?
Well, you know about 2.
I can buy a total of 4, but they have to be in 2 different transactions. I literally have to take them out to my car, come back in, and buy them on a separate transaction. So yes. Yes.
I think that Sheetz is even less than that.
Oh, is it really?
I think so. You're only allowed to buy like 2 pounds at a time or something. You've got like the big ones.
Sheetz is planning for the future of their walk-in soda caves, though. Yes.
The thing I learned, I was reading about why Pennsylvania's alcohol laws are stupid.
They are
because post end of Prohibition, after they passed the 21st Amendment, we had a governor who was still very, very anti-alcohol. So right after that, he took any advantage he could in state laws and passed the strictest state laws he could.
We have dry counties in this state still. Places you literally cannot buy booze. So this is funny. Man, I learned a lesson today. Anytime the class is going slow, find a way to tie the conversation into alcohol. Wow. Why did it take you 6 years teaching to learn this? Wow. So everything else that we're going to be talking about, we'll put beer in the conversation somehow. But the point is well taken, though. In the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, who controls the sale and distribution of liquor?
The Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board.
Exactly. Who also legislates and enforces the law on liquor in the state of Pennsylvania?
Tobacco, alcohol, firearms.
And the Liquor Control Board. The Liquor Control Board, by the way, in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, is part of the state police. If somebody comes from the Liquor Control Board to check and see if you've been drinking underage, they are acting as a member of the state police because they are part of the state police. That is a regulated industry. We're starting to move to some deregulation because we can buy beer at certain stores and wine at certain stores now. Who's won in that equation, by the way? Who's that worked out well for? Sheetz definitely, but I'm thinking somebody else in general. Who's it worked out for? Consumer. It's worked out for the consumer. I have more choices when I go to a six-pack store now than I did 10 years ago because there's competition, because I can also get it at Sheetz, because I can get it at a lot of stores. I can buy wine from kiosks and Walmart at this point in some places. So deregulation is generally pretty good. There are times when it is not, however. The airline industry operates on very thin margins. So when it was open to competition, you would think that would be great for the consumer. Sometimes it is. It's not so good if you're in the middle of a fuel crisis. And a lot of airlines started falling off and going bankrupt. And all of a sudden, we had more folks who were trying to have non-union carriers so that they could pay lower wages and be more competitive. So that's been one of the big problems with deregulation in the airline industry. Now, in terms of the Staggers Rail Act of 1980, this also tried to give more flexibility to companies in terms of setting pay rates and staffing levels because the unions were very prohibitive in what they would and would not allow as well. So we haven't had as many strikes, but we've had a lot of unhappy people working in those industries. Guys, we also get into some other things that affect the law these days in terms of changes in our demographics. One of my favorites, for example, was the Employment Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. They call it the RESA for short. Here's the deal, guys. If you work for a union, and we talked about this a little on Friday, if you guys remember this, I'll be impressed. What's the difference between the way benefits are paid in union versus non-union companies? Who generally has a more generous benefits package? Somebody in a union company or non-union? Yeah, for sure. Most unions have what we refer to as a defined benefit plan. And that means you get a pension, you get guaranteed levels of benefit. Those of us who do not work in union environments typically have things like 401ks and defined contribution plans. Who here has ever heard of a 401k? Excellent. Okay, let's say Adam and I both are participating in a 401k program. We both make the same salary. He's contributing 15% into his 401k. I'm only contributing 8% into mine. Who's going to have a better retirement, Adam or me? Adam's going to have a way better retirement. Now, Ryan and I work for a union company, and we've both been in it for 25 years. Who's going to have a better retirement fund, Ryan or me? It's a trick question. Who's going to have a better retirement fund? We're going to have the same, because it's a defined benefit plan. And so what we basically said in 1974, we were giving some guidance to allow people to have a certain minimum guaranteed benefits for pension and health care plans. So in other words, if you were offering a pension or a benefit plan to your employees, it had to meet minimum levels. We've tried to do something similar with things like the Affordable Care Act, but this was the first step at it. Guys, the second part that we really were trying to make labor more open to people of all abilities was the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, the ADA. Guys, if you think about persons with disabilities, we can think of physical and intellectual disabilities. We can think of psychological disabilities. We've got an entire segment of the population right now, for example, who may have disabilities we cannot see. What would be an example of that? Yes? Yeah, people who have mental health, possibly even, under certain circumstances, people who are recovering drug addicts are covered under this act as well. Where are we getting a lot of people coming back from with mental and physical disabilities over the last, 19 years? Yes?
War.
You got it. Guys, we start talking about TBIs, traumatic brain injuries, and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Those are two big laws now, not laws, but disorders that are covered under ADA. Here's something I'm going to tell you, too, about the unintended consequences of warfare. Guys, we see rapid advances in prosthetics anytime there's a war. When I say prosthetics, what are prosthetics? Who's heard of that term before? What are they, Corey?
Basically, artificial legs or bodies or...
Exactly right. In the current conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, we've seen more people get arms and legs blown off than any other conflict we've ever experienced in the history of human warfare. We're figuring out new and wonderful ways to really maim people for life. That's terrible. The good part about it is, however, because this is a military action, the military's got big bucks to put into figuring out ways to make limbs to make people whole again. Here's been one of the tricks, too. This could show up as a bonus question. Guys, in the current conflicts, women are really having a tough time with the rehab aspect. Do you know why? There's been very little research put into replacing limbs on females because, typically speaking, until the current wars, women were not typically in active combat. This is the first war where we've seen a lot of people coming back, females coming back missing limbs. The other reason we're seeing so many people with missing limbs at this point in time, the body armor that protects our vital organs has gotten better. So more people are living through the impact. So the sad part about war is people get hurt, people get killed, people get traumatized. The good part about any of it is that some of the things we learn end up being beneficial to other people. So the same cancer victim who might get a replacement leg might have received a better leg because people went to war and there was funding to back it up. So anybody ever seen somebody walking on the new mechanical legs, by the way? They're genuinely cybernetic. This stuff is being developed in Pittsburgh, just in case you were wondering. University of Pittsburgh Medical Center and a few other groups out there are doing crazy, amazing stuff with that. I've seen some of this stuff firsthand. It's unbelievable. But we're going to watch a brief video in a moment on the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. The other part of this particular era of legislation was the Bankruptcy Act of 1984, which meant basically if your company's going under, if you're going bankrupt, if you're literally going out of business, you still have to try to make people whole who were members of a union. It was a common tactic prior to this time. If a company wanted to get rid of a union, they would declare bankruptcy, move their money out of that company and start another company so they could restart it without a union workforce. The Bankruptcy Act of 1984 basically said you can no longer do this. You need to cooperate with the union for matters of bankruptcy. And it comes down to one of the things I had to learn. I was working with a guy who was doing state-level advocacy for deaf individuals. And this guy's name was Sandy, and he was a great guy. He was an administrator for the state of Pennsylvania. And we were working on making equal career opportunities for people who were deaf. And what I had to learn, for example, Jared, will you be my proctor? Come up here for a second. You and Ryan, will you come up here? If I was having a conversation and Jared was Sandy, who was deaf, and Ryan was his interpreter, stand next to him if you would. If I was speaking with Jared and Ryan were doing American Sign Language, I still was to make eye contact with Jared. And that was a tough thing to do because when somebody is speaking to you, your first inclination is to look at them. So it was a real cultural thing for me to get used to doing that. So thank you guys for standing up and being my props. So sometimes understanding other cultures is not even leaving your own town or your own state to realize there are subcultures there and people who get forgotten about. I think it's also interesting when we think about, for example, we talk about this in my Management 201, which is an HR class. But right now, guys, the unemployment rate in the United States we know is less than 4% for overall. If you took just people with disabilities, what's their unemployment rate? Any guesses? Yes? It's not that high, but it's over 10. So generally speaking, the unemployment rate for persons with disabilities is roughly twice that for people who are, we would like to refer to as normally able. And so that we needed this law. We needed to equalize the playing field for everybody else. We'll talk a little bit more about ADA and 201 than we talk about it here, but the point is that it really was intended to be something that would make things easier for individuals of all abilities to be able to enter the workforce. Here's the other part of it too, guys. If somebody, unless they've got a severe disability, a lot of folks with disabilities age out of the systems by the time they turn 21. And if we don't give them employment opportunities, what hope do they have to have a life that's going to be fulfilling to them as well? So, guys, before we get into the WARN Act, we're stopping for our first question and answer of the session. We've been going pretty hard and fast here. Yes, sir.
My question is for the chapter 4 assignment. It says assignment is part of the module. It's not available yet, and it's due tonight. So
yeah, like I said before in class, guys, we're always going to be a little behind. We haven't hit chapter 4 yet. Don't worry about it. Yeah, we'll adjust that time. Thanks for bringing that up, Corey. So if you're seeing that come up, don't worry about it. Other questions? Go ahead, Elliot.
I thought about it when Bush said the final wall of exclusion when he passed the ADA Act for disabled people. But I think in today's generation, I think the one group of people that are still trying to fight to be non-discriminated are probably people of the LGBTQ community. Because I mean, I've read the Supreme Court cases and I've read also some things, but they really don't have any protection, as well as I remember you saying about from a federal standpoint of transgender people, you were recognized by the gender on your birth certificate.
That's exactly correct, guys. And Elliot, that's an excellent point. When we think about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we're going to talk about that because it's the most important piece of civil rights legislation in the history of the country. But there were several notable exceptions. Persons with disabilities weren't covered, and neither were people I'll use the term, and I hope I don't offend anybody when I use the term, when we say people who have quote-unquote alternative lifestyles weren't covered either. And so if somebody, for example, in 2019 is transgender at a federal level, you're going to be recognized by the gender on your birth certificate. So in the state of Pennsylvania, for example, if somebody was born as male and now identifies as female, they cannot claim that they've been discriminated on the basis of sex for being a female when their birth certificate says they are a male. Now, state by states have had different statutes. For example, I believe California has their own state statute that protects transgender people or people of different sexual orientations, but most states still do not. That's an excellent point. Other questions? Okay, guys, we're going to keep going. Again, we talked about some of the acts that are supposed to protect employees. The Worker Adjustment Retraining Notification Act, the Warren Act of 1988. Guys, the 80s was a very wild decade because on one hand we had all this amazing stuff happening in terms of technology that would eventually become the internet. On the other part of it, we had some pretty wild rides on the economy driven by things like the junk bond phrase. Who here has ever seen The Wolf of Wall Street? Yeah, the stock market was a wild and crazy place to be. As a result, companies were closing left and right. What else was happening in the 1980s in our country? We had a lot of industry that was leaving. Believe it or not, up until the 1980s in Altoona, Pennsylvania, they made parts for televisions. They still made them in the United States back in those days. All those industries started leaving, so we ended up getting what we refer to as the Warren Act. We also get the what we refer to as the RICO Act, and that's the Racketeer, Influence, and Corrupt Organizations Act of 1970. What this said that we are going to crack down on racketeering. When we say racketeering, what does that word mean to you? What is racketeering? It sounds like a very criminal kind of thing, because it is. Basically, if we are conspiring, if we're racketeering, maybe Kenny and I are price fixing. We're going to say our company's only going to charge this price. It's an antitrust type of violation. So we're going to make this gentleman's agreement that we're going to control our own market. We're the only two suppliers. We're going to keep our prices equal so neither one of us keeps an advantage. The fact that we're conspiring to do this makes it racketeering. Unions have also been accused of racketeering as well, and some of this law was also targeted toward unions to make sure, for example, they could not hold companies hostage. If a bunch of unions got together and said we're all going to work for the same rate, and make it impossible for these companies to have any leverage at all, that could also be considered racketeering. But because we're explaining some of this stuff with videos, we're going to show you a brief video where, especially if these factories or plants are tied into the local economy. So remember that. All right, guys, and we're moving through a couple other big laws. We're going to show, actually, probably the Civil Rights Act of 1964 will probably be our last video today, but we'll have some more conversation. Guys, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a landmark piece of legislation because it was supposed to remove the final barriers that made the workplace equal. Guys, we go back to that period of time, 1964, where we literally would decide what water fountain we were using based on the color of our skin. So the criteria that was listed there basically were race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. You notice gender identity is not on here, neither is physical ability. You also might notice that there was an act in 1964 and a follow-up in 1991. Here's the reason for that. 64 basically said you can't do this anymore, employers. You cannot discriminate like this. 1991, Congress basically said, okay, we've already told you you can't do this. Well, if you do it, employer, you're also going to be liable for damages. So employees, as of 1991, could sue employers for damages if they were discriminated against. Then we get into the ADEA, the Age Discrimination and Employment Act of 1967. I love this because it covers me. If you're over 40 years of age, you can't be fired just for being old. So if they come into my office and say, Tonkin, you look funny and you smell bad, but you're doing an okay job, they can't fire me just for looking funny and smelling bad because I'm over 40. So I like that law in particular. So in terms of executive orders, I'm not going to ask you about these on an exam. All this basically means is the executive orders that came out regarding these laws said that government and government contractors had to also comply with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the ADEA of 1967. Guys, let's celebrate the passage of the Civil Rights